which he'd spent his entire life. Others talked of how the company had destroyed their crops and grave sites, polluted their streams, and run them out of their homes. "What I've lost is plenty," a 53-year-old woman told me through tears. "We can't plant plantains. We can't plant rice. We can't plant peppers." The police, who had ripped out her crops to replace them with oil palm, had given the woman a one-time payment of a few $100s. "It's finished a long time ago," she told me. A Monrovia-based lawyer advocating for the locals lamented the community members' loss of identity. "The guy who was a respected farmer," he said, "has now become a slave laborer." The company responsible for the changes had been in operation in Sino for just 13 months. It had signed an 865,000-acre lease, good for 65 years, with an option for a 33-year extension. In other words, it was just getting started. I ended up not going with the rape me thing for the start of my article. I could picture my editors rolling their eyes, but the sick-making feeling from that trip stayed with me long after I'd filed my piece. The whole experience had hit weirdly close to home. While I may have been clueless about palm oil, I do know something about life on the equator in a remote African village. In my 20s, I spent 2 years working as a Peace Corps volunteer in Western Kenya. I'd taught English and math to high school students in a tiny outpost hundreds of miles from the nearest khaki-clad tourist. There was no electricity or running water in the hamlet known as Buhui, and back then there were no cell phones either. I would wake with the roosters, heat a pan of water over a camp stove for a splash bath, breakfast on papaya and milky tea, and then hop on my bike for the ride down the orange dirt road to school. In the evenings, I'd compose long letters by candlelight, or settle in under the mosquito net with a flashlight and a novel. It was lonely at times, and I came down with malaria twice, but in many respects those 27 months were the happiest of my life. I loved the sound of the rain on my corrugated tin roof, and the smell of the mud drying in the equatorial sun. I loved the slow rhythm of the days, the lack of pretense in my exchanges with the locals, the absence of extraneous anything. Of course, there was also deep poverty in that village, and plenty of frustration over the dearth of opportunity and the snail-like pace of change. It's possible I loved it so much only because I knew I had a ticket out. But the people of Buhui had neat farms and close-knit families. They had rich soil, mango and jackfruit trees, maybe a cow or some chickens. The air was fresh and the rivers ran clear. We all laughed a lot. In the aftermath of my reporting trip, I was waking from nightmares about having returned to Buhui to find that all my students' farms had been replanted with oil palm. My village looked like that horrible corner of Liberia. But don't get me wrong, I know that nothing about international development is straightforward. I've also lain awake wondering whether I'd done that Liberia story justice. Had my visceral anger been misplaced? Had mine been the naive take of your typical parachuting-in journalist, one with health insurance and a gym membership back home in Brooklyn? Certainly, the Liberia that I'd observed outside of those plantations was no Disney theme park. The road we'd taken from Monrovia, for instance, had been so riven with ditches, potholes, and impromptu lakes that it had taken us 8 hours to go a mere 150 miles. Sino County, though home to more than 100,000 people, had the aura of a place forgotten to time. "This is the city?" the photographer had remarked as we finally rolled into its capital. "This is a shantytown." By the time I arrived in Liberia, the country was more than a decade out from the brutal civil wars that had engulfed it from 1989 to 2003, taking some 250,000 lives in the process. The Ebola outbreak wouldn't happen for another year, when it would nearly kill one of those researchers in the Land Cruiser, but that's a story for another time. Even so, the place was in bad shape. What little success Johnson Sirleaf had achieved with its economy had come in the form of concession agreements signed with outsiders drawn to the country's natural wealth.